Anthony Verdeja here, Vice President of Strategy and Sales for HeartHero, here with Craig Peterson, former HeartStream and Philips employee. And Craig, I will let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Anthony. A pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. My career in the medical device industry spanned 35 years. I started as a territory sales representative for a division of Johnson & Johnson back in 1980, and I retired in 2015. Most of my focus was in the cardiac arena, either in patient monitoring or external defibrillators. I spent quite a bit of the latter stages of my career in that capacity, specifically with HeartStream, the startup, and then the subsequent companies that acquired them, lastly being Philips. I think that's the relevant connection with you, if you will.
Yes. We overlapped a few times at Philips for a few years there, and it was great. And I'm glad to have you here and looking forward to hearing more about kind of your experience in the AED industry and any correlations with HeartHero, what we can learn from your past experiences. To kick it off, since we are an AED company, we want to hear about the early days of HeartStream. You know, they're kind of the godfather when it comes to what AEDs are now and your experiences there, and tell me about the passion behind it and what you guys did.
Sure. Well, I wasn't there for the earliest days. I came to HeartStream just after the launch of the initial Forerunner, but I certainly began to develop an appreciation for what was going on there. I think that the context that's important in the defibrillation field, if you will, at that time was that external defibrillators were only geared for being in the hands of professionals, people with a true duty to respond, and a fairly narrow group, paramedics and EMTs. So somebody with either advanced life support or basic life support. Even, police officers, security guards, that kind of thing, they really didn't fit the bill for that. There had been one attempt to launch a home defibrillator earlier than that, and it was minimally successful, if you will. So HeartStream's vision was to build an AED that could literally be put in the hands of someone without any training, and they'd be able to successfully defibrillate somebody. And so really there were a couple of key elements to that in terms of what they needed to accomplish. One was that they had to have a very solid user interface, a device that you could put in the hands of somebody and they could, in fact, get through a stressful situation, get pads on appropriately, and deliver a shock if needed. The second was robustness of the device. They couldn't be needing heavy maintenance, if you will, by a biomedical engineer or something like that. So things such as non-rechargeable batteries and self-tests and all of that were important. And then thirdly, it had to be small. And so that's really where biphasic defibrillation came in, low energy biphasic specifically, because it permitted the engineers to minimize the size of the device, particularly in comparison to other AEDs at that point, and achieve that end result. And they did. They achieved all three. And they and other companies that were in the same space really changed the landscape in terms of where defibrillators were used. You all of a sudden had them on airlines and in airports with police officers and in public access settings. And that's really been what's driven that industry, I think, for the last roughly 25 years now.
Yeah, that's great. I think you touched on something that I want to follow up with in a second, with usability. But first, let's talk about how you got involved with HeartStream and how that came about in your career at HeartStream for a little bit.
Oh yeah, well, just personally, I had started my career in sales. I moved into marketing, and I was involved in product management for a startup firm down in the Portland area. Mm-hmm. And some friends of mine who had gone to work for HeartStream, some guys that I'd worked with, recommended me to the HeartStream team. They called me and said, we're looking for somebody in a marketing capacity, and would you be interested? And it was kind of a good time from a life standpoint in terms of where my kids were in the stage of growing up, and a chance to get back to Seattle, which was my hometown. That's where I grew up, where I went to college. And just a very compelling company. I mean, a culture and an air to them that was very different than anything I'd seen. It was extremely intriguing. And I felt very blessed and honored, really, that I got an offer. And so I started there in, May of 1997. And ended up finishing my career in that continuum of companies.
That's great. That's great. Tell me a little bit, you touched on it, the company and being honored to work with them. What was that passion like? What was their drive like there as a startup?
I think that what stood out to me was that people were all about learning, and they weren't afraid of failure. If something that they tried wasn't going to work, they would see it, register that as a learning experience, and move on. It allowed them to really try a lot of different things that hadn't really been tried before. And I think one of the best examples was, and again, I wasn't involved in this, but I heard from folks who were, the exercises they went through with, if you will, simulated rescues with laypersons in trying to get the prompting and the instructions and the signage and everything on the device correct so that folks could place pads correctly. And they ate a lot of crow along the way. They were things that they thought would be really logical and would register with someone would not. And so they'd constantly have to go back to the drawing board. And it finally led to what turned out to be a very successful and, if you will, useful application, a repeatably successful application with people, was the specific pictures on the pads with the arrow that says one pad goes in one place and one goes in the other. You can reverse the polarity of the pads, and the defibrillator will continue to work correctly. But they found that giving a lay responder that choice paralyzed them in many cases. And so having that specific instruction with the circle and the arrow on it was critical. And I think you see that practice, throughout the industry in terms of having that sort of level of specificity around what to do as you're preparing to get this device attached to a potential cardiac arrest victim.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight, and it's so relevant for us. We've been through multiple usability studies now, and you always think you have the right answer, and you've thought through everything and anything that someone could possibly do, and every time it surprises you. So we've learned a lot through our usability studies. Is there anything else you guys learned in your usability studies? What was the Forerunner, the FR2, the On-Site, the FRX? I think there's been a lot of industry standards set by the HeartStream and Philips team that are now adopted, and there's still things to improve upon that we've learned. When we go through our usability studies, you think that everyone knows an AED, and not everyone does. So anything you can share on that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Well, another one that I think came in later generations that again had to do with readiness for use. That's always a critical aspect of it. And in fact, just interestingly enough, in the last couple of months, I happened to be in two situations where I happened to see AEDs on a wall. And they were different brands, and it really doesn't matter what the brand was. But one was a general store in a small town in north central Washington state. Another was in a pro shop of a golf course. And I just mentioned to people in both places that I was familiar with the devices, and they both said, ours isn't ready for use. They need new batteries, new pads, whatever the case may be, which I thought was rather interesting. And the circumstances around them were a little bit different in both cases. But yeah, going back to why is that relevant? Well, I was thinking about one of the things that we talked about as we extended our product franchise from the original Forerunner, the FR2, which was largely an extension of Forerunner with better battery life being kind of the main thrust of that particular product. But was, okay, well, we've got self-test that ensures that the circuitry is okay, the battery is okay. With pre-connected pads, like we had in later models, we also tested the integrity of the pads themselves. So again, not relying on folks to check expiration dates when the moisture is sufficiently no longer moist enough the gel is no longer moist enough, if you will. It gives you a prompt that says time to change the pads. And I think that, again, is a good example of wanting to have the devices as foolproof as you possibly can and knowing that they're ready for use, whenever you need to rely on it. Because had there been a cardiac arrest in those two particular situations, they would have been out of luck. Well, actually, the victim would have been out of luck. So I think that's an important aspect of that, of public access defibrillation, if you will, lay responder defibrillation.
I totally agree. I think, if I recall correctly from my time at Philips, most of the customer complaints we had were from someone calling in saying, hey, my device is beeping and it says my pads are bad, but I just bought this device 3 months ago. And usually it was someone who peeled open the on-site case and wanted to see how sticky the pads were and put it back in. without
Yeah.
that self-test, you would never have known that those pads are bad now. So that is a very,
Yeah.
very critical one. And it's cool to hear the background on that. So that's great.